Boker tov lekulam. Good morning, everybody. We have three papers in this panel. First with Nena Mocnik, which I will introduce in a minute. Later Ina Sukenko, and it would be by Zoom, and Professor Amal Jamal. So I will just introduce you, Nena Mocnik. Nena Mocnik is Maria Curie Utopia SIF co-found postdoctoral fellow in GRITIM, UPF Barcelona, and the first digital humanism fellow awarded by the Austrian Federal Minister of Climate Action in Vienna. As a researcher, educator, and community worker, she is interested in the topic of collective trauma, identity, gender violence, and art-based sociotherapy. She is the author of two monographs, Trauma, Transmission and Sexual Violence, Reconciliation and Peace Building in Post-Conflict Setting, 2021, and in first book, Sexuality After War Rape, From Narrative to Embodied Research in Routledge 2017, which awarded of Montreal Award of Women's Studies in Ottawa in 2018. She is collaborated with the European Association of History Educator and consulting on trauma, informed history education and teaching history in difficult and post-conflict settings. With the financial support of the European Commission and the European Remembrance Program and 7 universities and NGOs partners, she initiated a led project, #NeverAgain, Teachings Transmission of Trauma and Remembrance through Experimental Learning. She was an editor-in-chief of Special Issues, Lessons from Sexual Violence in Mass Atrocity Crimes towards Preventive Pedagogies in History Education, 2021, and Secondary Trauma in Field-Based Social Research, and an edited handbook engaging with historical trauma, learning and pedagogies in resilience, Routledge 2021. In addition to her academic work, she regularly volunteers as a humanitarian worker in grassroots local charities. Thank you.
Thank you. What should I do with the presentation? Not to switch off Zoom. Thanks a lot. First of all, thank you for hosting me. I'm really happy to be here. And also I would like to say that even though I know that it's an academic conference, I want to speak as a humanitarian worker today, because I believe that there is really a huge gap usually between academic scholarly work and between the practice. So just very briefly, for the a little bit more than 10 years, I have been working with in post-conflict settings with the survivors of sexual violence. So I don't know if I have to do trigger warning here with the conversation that we had before or not. So my work was related to recovery and rehabilitation of particularly women war rape survivors in post-Yugoslav context. So I was observing the collective trauma and rehabilitation of these women and families in the score of 30 years. And
you can continue. I will just share the presentation to the Zoom.
Okay. Then in 2020, just before pandemic, I had a serious burnout. And I think this is also something that perhaps we should speak when we talk about violence. Getting vicarious trauma or being traumatized because we are being exposed to people that are traumatized because of the first-hand violence. So I decided to take a break, and then pandemic started. I was in Paris at this time, where I live. Because I was on this forced recovery, so I made a break from academia. At one point, I just started to volunteer to do humanitarian work. We had a serious lack of volunteers at this time because of the closed borders in the suburbs of Paris and in northern France. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the jungle. I would say, one of the biggest illegal refugee settlements in northern France. So I was back to the work, still burnout, but somehow I started to engage a lot. Also before, I worked as humanitarian worker, particularly in 2015 in the Balkan route, with refugees that were coming from Syria at this time. But in 2020, I particularly focused on women that were based in, as I said, in banlieue of Paris, and women that survive different types of sexual violence, so either before in their own countries or on the route to Europe. So it was violence that was related particularly to trafficking or transactional sex, so sex that they were using to basically get food and shelter for their kids, or violence that was happening also between humanitarian workers and refugees because of the power relationship. So this is also one type of violence that is quite, I would say, a bit ignored sometimes, but is happening a lot. When focusing on what was happening to this woman, I realized that, of course, trauma that women refugees experience is very different, is very particular because of their gender. Here, I would also like to say that, of course, when we talk about gender-based violence, there is a lot of reference made to women. I would like to say that, of course, I acknowledge that the specter is way bigger. I am focusing on this because I had an experience before, and also because I just think that we as professionals, we have to limit our work and our interest at a certain point to be more effective. So at this point, as a humanitarian worker, I'm very tall, so I'm trying to... as a humanitarian worker, I started to observe what is happening to these women and how we could help them with basically providing them services that would be focused on the trauma that they experience. So support, meaning psychological, social, different types of support, also connecting with the resettled communities. And of course, because of pandemic, I think everyone was focused on mass digitalization at this time. All the world went online, and the same thing was happening also with refugees. So already in 2015, and you have a lot of studies done where how refugees were engaging already back then with different applications, different tools, different online platforms on their journey. And in 2020, because of the pandemic, of course, this digitalization just really expanded massively. And I realized that women refugees are using their phones a lot to connect with people in the countries of resettlement, but also to search for information. But because when we talk about specific needs, so this needs related to their trauma, which is a consequence of sexual violence or other type of gender-based violence, this information very often is also very culturally stigmatized. So even though if women would like to search for information and they have their mobile phones and internet connection, a lot of times they would just not go and search for it because they are afraid of the search history, right? So I'm not gonna search for, I don't know, contraception because this might be problematic if my brother, my husband, whoever finds this. So how do I still get how do I access this? What do I do if I get pregnant and I don't want to get pregnant? And I would like to tell you that there is a lot of women getting pregnant also from the relationships that they are in. So not just from violence that happens to them because of trafficking or whatever, but also those women who are traveling with their partners, they get pregnant because even though if we are exposed to violence and war, we still keep having sexual intercourses. And a lot of women that are in these conditions would not want to be pregnant because when you don't have a shelter, when you need to move, when you don't know where you end up in after 1 month, of course, pregnancy is really, really traumatic. So it's not a happy event like, wow, I'm pregnant, but it's really, what do I do now with this child? So how do we then help women to find all this information and also services? For instance, in France, a lot of these services are available to asylum seeker people and refugees that are in transitioning. But if you cannot find the information, if you cannot find access, or if these things are culturally stigmatized, then of course you are stuck. So you cannot terminate, for instance, your pregnancy, even if you could and if you would want to. So these are all the questions that I've been dealing with. But then when borders open and when I restarted my academic life, I started to develop basically a real product. So I am now in the process of developing either application for a app or like online platform where all these informations would be available. But it's very challenging because there is a lot of issues, there is a lot of obstacles that I didn't expect, because to me it was just like, wow, I just invent another app and wow, women will go there, they will access information, problem solved. But when you start to do things in practical life, it's not so easy. And today I prepared this presentation in a way that I will ask you some questions, and please help me because I'm stuck now, so I don't know how to continue, and I really hope, because we are very interdisciplinary here, that you might have some ideas and yeah, maybe help me out. First of all, the biggest problem that I face now is that one thing is practice and another thing is academic, is a scholarship, right? So when we think about problems, when we think about problems in academic world, we really like to deconstruct a lot of things, right? So when I started to talk in academic environment about I am developing an app or a platform or a product that will help, that will serve women refugees, there was immediately a pushback like, okay, who is women refugees? Can you define? You are simplifying it. It's a very, very broad category. And I understand this because women refugees in Europe is something completely different than women refugees, for instance, in northern Uganda, where I also work. Now, for me, what is important in this product is that when you search for information, it's something that is related to a specifically problems, issues, challenges that are related to your health as a woman. So your biological needs, meaning menstruation, pregnancy, protection, sexually transmitted diseases, which of course we all can be affected. I don't know, different diseases that women who are breastfeeding have, and so on. Now, when I was presenting this in academic world, the problem was like, okay, so you are flattening out the experience of all these women, just calling them refugee women, because women are coming from very, very diverse backgrounds. They're coming from very different cultural, religious backgrounds, from very, very different classes. So how can you address all these women with one simple terminology or with one simple address? Because here is also a big you risk basically to victimize people who would not to call themselves refugee women. Now, okay, I can understand this in academic context, but when I come to funders, they want to have a very concrete idea. They really don't care how I'm flattening out the refugee woman concept. The next problem that I encountered specifically when I was presenting my concrete project in conferences with feminist and gender emphasized was that because, as you can see, I'm white. I think I couldn't be more white. Biologically, I have blue eyes, blonde hair, but I'm also very, very European by education class. Class in terms of, I would say mostly not financially, but in terms of education. So when I work with women that come by land illegally, so I'm not talking about legal migrations with usually upper class, but women that are migrating illegally by land, by boats, by all the horrifying ways of transiting that you can imagine. We usually talk about really huge gap, not just between like racial gap, but also class educational gap. So I literally am there when I work in the camps in Calais and also in suburbs of Paris. I am symbolic presentation of white, educated Western woman. So this was, of course, I cannot step out of this. I can be critical toward it. I can acknowledge it. I can be open, question it, but still, when I am on the field with this woman, I am definitely a symbol of this difference. Now, when we talk about theoretical theoretical problems with this, particularly with post-colonial or neo-colonial understanding or critics of humanitarian work, is that when people like me, individuals like me, offer humanitarian service, humanitarian support, we also, if you want, provoke this kind of symbolic or perpetuate this kind of symbolic violence of post-colonial tendencies, where automatically a white upper-class educated woman is offering support to non-educated brown third world woman. I don't know if you are familiar with this concept. It's a Mohanty's concept from, it's quite old now. So she basically conceptualized the third woman concept to understand the group, if you want, the group of women that are non-white, non-Western women, usually not only referring to race or place of origin, culturally, racially, ethnically, and so on, but as well to distinguish or to keep distinguishing Western and non-Western. So non-white woman, third world woman, which usually is, when we refer to refugee women in Europe, third world woman connotes also a woman that is escaping from so-called brown violence. So we, as white women, we are not saving this woman just from conflict violence, so from collective violence like war conflicts and so on, but we are saving them also to a very particular brown men violence. I'm now talking about criticisms from the feminist and gender literature that I'm referring to in my paper. So when we come to this relationship, when me as a white European woman is offering support to those women that are coming to Europe, we immediately, by these scholars, we immediately perpetuate or keep perpetuating the symbolic violence of course, post-colonial power relationship by understanding that refugee women or third world women are women that are also escaping from the type of violence that we, and when I say we, we as Europeans, we don't have. So there is a specific cultural type of violence that those women are escaping to Europe, and in this way we perpetuate also the white saviorism, I would say, idea. Now, in practice, the problem with trying to understand that these women are coming from different contexts is that we have very, very scarce resources. So when women come to Europe, particularly now I will be talking, for instance, this example from Calais, when they come, when they transit, sometimes people stay, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months, sometimes also a few years, some people, but some people come for a week, for 2 weeks, for 2 days. So it's really, really extremely hard to differentiate and to understand the complexity of an entire world, because we have women, at one point we have women coming particularly mostly from Afghanistan, and of course the cultural context there is very, very different than women that we were getting, I don't know, from Sudan at one point. Then, of course, last year the situation was completely changed with Ukraine, because even though a lot of Ukrainians were migrating, I would say, in quite legal ways, we also had people in Calais from Ukraine who came and were treated by state, by a lot of humanitarian organizations very, very differently. But also for us, it was a big game changer. Like, okay, now we have all this criticism of post-colonial, but at the same time, Ukrainians are considered as Europeans. So where do we stand now with this differentiation? So this diversity, I will talk a bit later as well, is really important for me now, because there is a lot of debate about how we should provide a culturally sensitive care, so humanitarian care, but then also healthcare in general. And as much as I agree that it's important, it's also, I would say, very dangerous, because when you start to assume that a woman, for instance, who comes from Afghanistan, requires a culturally sensitive care, it can also perpetuate a lot of stereotypes. So what does it mean to provide culturally sensitive care for a woman from Afghanistan? Because there is 80% of women that are coming from extremely religious contexts. Now, we have to consider all women like this. Also, we have women from Afghanistan from all these tribes, and when you work in Calais, you learn that Afghanistan is a state, but there is, I don't know, 25 tribes at least that we are receiving people extremely, extremely different, with very, very different values, with very different habits and so on. So how do we provide culturally sensitive care? Where does it end? It's really, really a huge field to cover. And do we have resources to this? So this is a big issue. So how do we define culturally sensitive care? What are the limits, and what is actually also in practice possible? When I read about theory, I completely understand and agree. But when you go on the field, it's very, very challenging to really bring this to and to realize this culturally sensitive care. Another thing I already mentioned, white saviorism, I would not say legacy, because I think we are all clear that this is happening and that it's very, very alive in all the structures, particularly in Europe. Also, when you work between, trying to get funds, support from the state, then we have to work a lot with the CRS, which is a French border police. Then we have to deal with local population, which is extremely racist. There is a lot of fear. A lot of pushbacks. So of course there is still this component of white saviorism, I would say, always present, also because particularly with, during pandemic, because we didn't have a lot of force, I would say, for humanitarian care. There was mostly people who could afford volunteer and help. This means that during pandemic, we still had salaries, we still had jobs, we had home to go. So people who sometimes also help in humanitarian care and are coming from the communities that are like resettled communities. I don't know. We have, for instance, volunteers that originate from Afghanistan that are helping with translation, but also with the care, with the proposals how to deal with people. Those people usually are coming from the communities that are very, very marginalized. So during the pandemic, they could not afford to offer her. So here we had this gap that only people from, I would say, middle class who were still doing quite okay during pandemic, who still had jobs, could do this. And this was mostly white Europeans. And we, again, had this a problem of power relationship. Then the criticism in theory with white savior complexes goes even further, because, of course, feminism was first like white feminism that is today subjected to a lot of criticism, that it ignores intersectionality of race, class, and all these things. So basically, there was this tendency in humanitarian work, and it still is in the countries of development, but also in Europe, in the camps that I mentioned, that of course women that are usually intervening in humanitarian aid are coming from this very particular background, very often with this, I would say, white feminist background or tradition or education. Where all of a sudden, and I think somebody mentioned this today, the importance of representation, all of a sudden we speak in the name of those other women. So those women that are usually non-white, that are coming from this other context. And here the problem is as well, if we are talking about rapes or what is going on in Europe, it's our issues. But immediately when I start to talk about mass rapes that are happening in conflict in Sudan, I'm a white woman speaking about a violence that is happening elsewhere and creating this differentiation of like, this is happening, but they're not in Europe, so somewhere yeah. So again, we are creating this, I would say, power relationship, white, non-white, post-colonial, colonial, again, this with speaking for, as before we had a comment about representation, this I'm very, very much aware, because I've been speaking for women that were raped in Bosnia for the last 10 years. Why? Because two things. Sometimes, even if you would want people to represent their own stories for themselves, sometimes it's not possible because it's re-traumatizing them and people don't want to expose themselves. So I'm always asking myself, should we use the power that we have to talk on behalf of these people, or just wait that these people will eventually have strength and decide to talk about it? Secondly, also because sometimes when people resettle, for instance, they don't want to be engaged anymore in this work. So for instance, when we also think about representation or bringing people from the communities to work for the communities, for the members of the same communities, so for the new refugees, people would not want to go in humanitarian work because this was trauma for themselves. And once they are resettled, once they get asylum status, they want to start their own life away from this. So talking about having people represented in this work or speaking in the name of their communities, in theory, of course, it's a great idea, but in practice, it's also the question, do people who were traumatized actually want to talk about these traumas? Not everyone. Some people, yes, but not all. And the last thing I would say is also we talk a lot about voice. So who is having voice? Of course, again, I am academic, I have voice, I can write books, I'm European, all this power as you want, white, whatsoever. But I also ask myself that because somebody is a member of community and experience certain type of violence, does this personal experience value more than a professional knowledge? And I will just give you the very last example. For instance, when we had people coming from Ukraine now last year, we have a lot of conversation what to offer these women, because there were cases of women being raped. A lot of women in early March, when they arrived to Poland, when we were asking them like what type of violence they experienced, a lot of women denied. Of course, they were like, yeah, nothing, we just want shelter, give us food for children and blah, blah. So the thing is that sometimes you, as a professional, when you work in this field, you also recognize how people react in this way. So when you are severely traumatized, sometimes you need 5-10 years to speak up. So even if people will not come to us and say, we need this and this and this and this doesn't mean that it's not because they don't need it. It's just because also the way how trauma works. So now, just because they are members of community who is experiencing violence and are not capable to say what to say, and on the other hand, you have professionals who recognize throughout the years the patterns, how the trauma works and how people behave in certain. So which knowledge is now more important? Is it really just the first-hand experience, or we should also still value the professional experience? So I will leave it here. I had a couple of more things which are way more philosophical as well, that we are as well changing. So I would not say that just because we are white Europeans who are offering our support, humanitarian support, to people who are coming to Europe, that this is automatically our post-colonial tendency. I would also say that today, world is very, very much globalized, so we are also changing when we transit. So when we are receiving new information, when we are learning new things, we are also willing to give off certain cultural norms and to adopt new norms. So it's not always just imposing certain values. And also, I would say one thing that we can discuss, if you want at the end, I would say that sexual health or sexuality as such is cultural trauma for everyone. So I would not say that because in Europe we had a certain history of feminism and so on, and with the human rights that of course we can also draw a lot of criticism toward, I would not say that because of this now we should consider that everything what we offer today in Europe is European and white and with post-colonial tendencies, and everything what is coming from the refugees that are coming from all these different cultural backgrounds is something that is completely diverse. I think today it's way, 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 way more mixed, and that this knowledge is coming in different ways. And just saying that we need to understand this cultural sensitivity from other people, I would also say that we can easily also paternalize that, if you want, the third world woman, that okay, we need to be sensitive because there is this culture that stigmatizes certain things. No, very, very often women come with a very particular knowledge and ideas what they want and what they need. And this is something that if we would be just culturally sensitive, we would say like, no, it's something that in this culture, in this particular group, people don't talk. You understand? So I think it's very, very tricky to just think of cultural sensitivity today when the world is globalized, and with internet and digitalization, I think we are getting way more equal also in understanding about our needs related to sexual traumas. Thank you.